Um, Thank you. So these sessions are some of the best things you can do to learn how to use your voice and your experiences to make policy change for good. So it's great that you're here, and we hope you know how important your participation is today, and all the time. And just showing up is really, really important. So we know that everybody has their own stories to tell. And in this session, we're going to talk about how you use storytelling as a tool for advocacy, and we're actually going to explain how to draft pitches for your policy priorities or the changes that you want to see in your community or in your state. These are applicable in so many ways, so it's not just legislative purposes. So I'm really excited that we'll be able to have this conversation with you all. There's going to be a Q&A discussion point in a little while, but we're going to go over a couple of slides first for just getting started. The first thing that we want to go over is the Food Policy Council's mission, which is building a more equitable, accessible, economically vibrant, and environmentally sustainable food system in Rhode Island. It's also important to note that we're an independent nonprofit organization, so we are not affiliated with the state of Rhode Island or any political bodies, which really allows us to be nimble in our advocacy. And we are a 501c3 nonprofit. Also, I want to note that we are driven by the energy of volunteers who believe in this mission. So we do have a small staff and a board of directors that are taking the lead. But if you want to get involved in the Food Policy Council as a volunteer, you are strongly encouraged to do so. Doesn't matter what your level of experience is in food systems, we just want to work with people who care. These are the three core issue areas that the Food Policy Council focuses on. So that's food access and nutrition security, it's food business and economic development, and it's food, climate, and environment. All of these things are sort of the capstones to the working groups that we have and the primary charge for all of the efforts that we're leading. This is also something that's really important for us to go over before we get into the conversations that we're about to have. So to achieve our mission with those core issues, we recognize the ongoing need to restate this commitment of equity. So we recognize the fact that many negative impacts of Rhode Island's current food system are grounded in a history of colonialism, genocide of Indigenous people, slavery, private ownership of land, and the concentration of wealth and power in the hands of too few. We also recognize that people with visible and non-apparent disabilities are among the most marginalized groups in our country. RIFPC believes that when you shift power to be shared more equitably across communities in our state, we can transform our future together for generations to come. So as we're listening and learning today, I just want everyone to keep this in front of mind, especially when we think about the ways that Rhode Island's laws help or fail at furthering this commitment. And now I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Max, to take it away.
Thanks, Allie. And thanks everyone for joining today. And thank you, Allie, for continuing to ground these Policy for the People events in our commitment to equity. That is so important. And these events are one way that we at the council try to reduce barriers to civic engagement for Rhode Islanders that care about food. And so as we're kicking off our conversation today, I want to ensure that we're all starting on the same page with a similar understanding of advocacy. So to do that, let's begin with reviewing this definition. So we at the council define advocacy as a recommendation of a particular cause or policy. The recommendation can be positive or negative. It could be do this thing or don't do that thing. So there's flexibility, but either way, advocacy is about recommending something to someone. Do something or don't do something to a person. And so advocacy matters in public policy and civic engagement for a couple of reasons, right? As you can see on the screen, and there's a citation there for folks who want to fact check me. Research shows that testimony, which is another word, fancy word for written or verbal advocacy, does a couple of things. One, it affects legislators' awareness of an issue. So advocacy can be the way that legislators are first introduced to an issue. It can also be an opportunity to expose them to a new viewpoint on an issue that they hadn't considered before. Second, advocacy can contribute to or directly influence a legislator's decision-making. So in other words, advocacy can influence whether or not a legislator will support a policy, if they will vote for or against it, if they'll abstain from the vote altogether. And finally, third, advocacy. And finally, our third point here is that testimony and advocacy can change bill language. Uh, Either way, testimony and advocacy is an opportunity where folks can learn and hear from people in the community about concerns or issues with particular language or the way things are written, as well as explore alternative language that they might not have been exposed to, but that folks in their network may have seen from another state or heard of as another example. And so it can help influence the way that the bill language is actually written. And all of these are key. Advocacy is key to creating public policy change. And that's why it's so important that we advocate. And so now that we all are on the same page with advocacy and why it's important and what we need to do with it, I want to talk a little bit about stories and why we should use them in our advocacy. So in everyday life, we all use stories all the time. And it shouldn't be any different in our civic lives. Stories are an easy way for us to share our perceptions and experiences of events, as well as how they shape how we view and interact with the world. And so when we're talking about public policy, stories can really bring to life policy and show the failures or the benefits of a program. Moreover, people remember stories, so that's a main reason to use them. Some research, which I didn't include this citation, so you can't fact check me, but I can throw it in the chat after if you want to. Some research done by Chip and Dean Health from Stanford and Harvard universities, respectively, found that audience members only remember data or facts about 5% of the time. But in that same study, they found that audience members could remember 63% of audience members could remember a story that was shared with them. That's a big difference. 5% compared to 63%. So when we're thinking about the importance of stories, they're not only important in that they can bring policy to life, but they're memorable. People will think about them, they'll commit them to memory, and then they will share those stories back out. And stories are also useful because they give real world examples of where policy is succeeding or failing. When we think about stories, they are someone's real experience. They're not just something someone made up. And so when we're talking about these stories, they provide a real world example of what this policy or issue or topic that we're talking about looks like on the ground and how people are actually experiencing those issues. And we're not just talking from high up levels of policy that can be hard to really connect to on the ground experience that folks have. And finally, we use stories because they motivate people to take action. For example, if we think about climate change conversations, more people have been motivated to care because of organizations that have been sharing stories about, for example, the impact of the climate crisis on polar bears, right? I'm sure we can all remember in the 2010s when everyone was talking about the impact on polar bears. And that's an example of a story. Whereas most people are not motivated by statistics alone about climate change, but they can think of, those images and those stories of the polar bears, and that's a very connective message for them to want to take action. And so that's a little bit of background on why we want to use stories and why stories are so important. And so with this background, I want to introduce one of our council members, Jason, who's going to share a little bit about his experience with storytelling for change and the power that that has. So Jason is an RIFPC council member and an active member of our food access and nutrition security work group. Before returning to school to become a registered dietitian, which is what path he's currently on, he was working as a storyteller with a bunch of different national organizations. And now he's using those experiences to help fight for RIFPC priorities like healthy school meals for all. So I'm going to spotlight Jason for everyone, and we can spend some time hearing from Jason's experience about using stories. Thanks for offering, Jason.
Hey, everybody. Yeah, thanks for having me. So I want to start by asking a question to get everyone a little bit engaged. I think about this. I've been out in cafes and bars lately, as Max mentioned, finishing my internship work. And this is something that I've noticed for myself. But does anyone else, when you're at a cafe or a bar or a restaurant, or even if you're with people, do you find your attention sometimes getting pulled in different directions, maybe to a different conversation happening at a table near you? You're thinking about thing you have to do later. Raise your hand. Yes. Anyone? Everyone? Most people? It sounds like, yeah, most people do. You might have undiagnosed ADHD. Welcome to the club. If you do, it's actually a little bit of a superpower and you're ahead of the curve. It's a really awesome storytelling technique to be able to pay attention to different things going on. Although sometimes you might want to be focused on the conversation you're having. The reason why I want to start that off is to also highlight the fact that you kind of want to start when you're telling stories, you want to start with a hook and you want to grab people's attention. And sometimes it can be a little inflammatory. But we're in a world now where so much of our focus is being pulled in all different directions with work, with family, all those sorts of things. And so when you're telling stories, when you're trying to advocate, you really want to try to jump in with something that'll grab people's attention. As Max mentioned, I have experience mostly working storytelling at CBS and PBS Frontline. So this is kind of where my knowledge comes from. And at both of those organizations, we always said that we don't tell stories about issues, we tell stories about people. And that's really important, as Max was talking about, making the stories real and all the data points that we are researching, that we're trying to kind of bring together into a powerful delivery for legislators or other folks. Those are all important. And it's also really important to be able to bring the people in to the picture. So I have a short video. This is something that, to be honest, I don't remember if I worked on this one or my friend that I used to work at Frontline put this one together. I'm just going to show you the first minute of it, but it's a really good example of a character-driven story, and will inherently talk about an issue that is important to us. So.
Jason, I think you need to share your audio with us. We're seeing the pictures, but not hearing it.
Yeah. Max is on it. And while Max is doing that, this is from a film called Poor Kids from 2017.
We don't have a fridge, just the sink is our fridge. We have to get ice mostly every day because it melts during night. There's really not enough food. All there is cans of vegetables. So I've been eating vegetables. Poor people get Nutrition Club because they can't afford to get other food. Thank you very much. Nutrition Club is a bag of food that you get every Friday and you have to make last the whole weekend. I think there's a lot of people in America that need help with food because they're poor or they're either homeless or they're both.
Probably good. Thing. So that's just a quick snippet of the type of video that we would produce as like content marketing for the full film. But I wanted to show that example because you pretty much jump right in to a character in the film. And I say character, but obviously it's a real person with who's really struggling, and their family as well. These videos were at that time on Facebook, and thinking about, again, the attention span of folks, whether it's an elevator pitch or, you're just trying to grab someone's attention, whether it's online or in a conversation, That's really the way to do it, is trying to get them right from the beginning. And again, bring the real issue to light through through a person. And so you might not have this exact story to tell as it relates to food insecurity, but if you're all here, and for members of the Food Policy Council focused on different issue areas, you have some story to tell. You have a personal connection. That's why you're here. So I would recommend trying to tap into that. The way that I did that when I was testifying at the Senate Finance hearing for the Healthy School Meals for All bill, I was up there in some sort of suit and I looked like another white guy who's testifying. The first question, one of the first questions I would hope people would ask is what do you have to offer and why should we pay attention to you? And so the story that I told was about my Crohn's disease and how I got diagnosed. That pushed me into this new food space that I'm interested in and advocating from the perspective of I had a lot of privilege. I had access to healthcare. I had access to the food that I needed to keep my health to where it is now. And I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing now if I didn't. So I share that story to connect with the legislators that at that point, I don't know, it was like 4 hours in, they're probably hungry, they're tired, their feet hurt, they want to go home. And so that was my idea kind of at the last minute, just to connect and tell the story that I knew that would resonate. And at the end of the day, whether you're writing, whether you're having a conversation, whether you're making a video, the best stories that you can tell are the ones that you know. And so with that, I'll say that you can practice this anytime. I do this a lot when I'm out about in the world. Again, that's also from a little point of privilege that I have. I have extra minutes to spare here and there if I'm getting groceries or I don't know, at a cafe or something and checking out the register, that sort of thing. But you can practice telling stories and paying attention to those cues that people give you, whether it's body language or, you know, all sorts of cues that you can then pick up on and use at other times when you're sort of trying to do it for real. But yeah, I think that's pretty good. And also breathe. I forget to do that sometimes. It's good to breathe.
Thank you, Jason. Awesome. Well, with that, I want to bring Allie up onto the floor as well. And we're going to have a little bit of group convo.
Thank you, Jason. I love this. I think it's so helpful to have everything in context in real life, right? We can talk about storytelling all we want, but what does it look like? What does it mean? So with that, I think if anybody in this group, I would just love to know if there are times or experiences that you've all had where someone either shared a story with you or you shared a story with someone and it made a difference in some way. I think we can talk about food conversations, of course, but it doesn't have to be limited to food. I know for me, I feel like you can probably see my dog sleeping in the background of my screen, but that, I mean, that's the great equalizers, right? Our pets, our food, the things that feel like home to us, I think are a really nice and easy way to start having conversations and sharing stories with others that we don't necessarily connect with in other ways.
I'll share how I got into all of this. I never thought about food waste. And I'm part of this whole sustainability program and an MBA program. And then, I go to an event and they're telling all these great stories, well, great being a relative word, about, how much we're wasting and showing like the buckets of food that people are, rescuing and things like that. And then I started to realize how much work there was to be done. So, it was just, as you said, stories are powerful.
Super true. That's good to know, Isaac. Thank you. I think seeing that in our homes, right? A lot of, like, in my home, there is no solution for food waste other than me figuring out what to do with my own food waste. We don't have community composting where I live. I don't have a yard, so I can't do composting. So what does someone like me do, right? Start sharing my story with others and thinking about what solutions they have in their communities or in their situation. My best
Yep.
compost solution is that
We're
guy.
working on it.
Yeah. I'm grateful that my dog does like food scraps. I give him a lot of my veggie scraps, and whatever he can't have, I'll put in the freezer for stock. But it's true. I mean, I think it has to affect you personally first. Vernon, go for it.
Yeah, sorry I can't be on video today, but yeah, so I think when I was advocating, I think one of the more powerful stories, like for police reform or for food security, was like I'm not that far removed from slavery. So my grandmother's 90 some odd years old, right? So she actually grew up on a like sharecropping farm. Like it wasn't like I'm only like 2 generations removed from sharecropping. So yeah, like really sharing that story and sharing that experience, like growing up in the up here with family, like from the South, it was really, really powerful at that time when we were advocating for reparations for African Americans. So that kind of springboarded me to where I am now. So yeah, stories do matter.
It's extremely powerful. Thank you for sharing that, Vernon.
I'll go real quick. So I started reading this book called Resilient Kitchens, American Immigrant Cooking in a Time of Crisis. And I started doing it for like professional reasons because I was like, because I'm working on the state's emergency food plan. And this is reflecting back on immigrants' experience during the COVID pandemic. But I got together a couple of friends to read it together. And then we talked about it a couple of weeks ago. And it was really powerful to make a space and say, like, what was your experience? Because even though these are people I know, like nobody ever sat down and was like, took time and made space to be like, this was my experience. This was the experience of my elderly parents. This is the experience of my parents who don't speak English. This is the experience of me having a toddler. So I think just making that and like hearing stories and insight from people that I know pretty well that I had never heard before, So I think just making the space and taking time to hear each other's stories was also like, I don't know what change it made per se, except that it was just really interesting. Yeah, like to make that space and hear things.
I think the change could even just be building stronger relationships with your friends and your family in a way that you didn't realize that you could. I had an experience like that where last year I took a friend to a film screening. It was an event hosted by the Aquidneck Community Land Trust, and they were doing a movie at the Jane Pickens Theater that was called Common Ground. And it's a movie essentially about soil health and what we're doing about it. But she is a person who does not think about this world whatsoever. She buys Blue Apron meals and shops at big box stores on the regular basis and things like that. So but to this day, over a year later, she still talks about that film and how the idea of soil health had never occurred to her before. And she may not be an advocate at the State House, but she's having those conversations with people besides me. I know that for a fact, which I think is just as important sometimes. Oh, thanks for sharing that in the chat, Rachel. We'll make sure we include that with the follow-up materials from this.
I did just want to highlight one of the things that, the group did last year that I thought was effective was, we brought visuals of trash and compost to tell the story of the different alternatives that we have. And it was something very visual that our legislators could look at. And, by happenstance, one of the things of compost was like at the edge of the table. And one of the legislators came out over to us after and was like, oh, I was worried it was going to fall off the table. So, just it drew it a little more from the abstract to like, this is what's actually in front of you. This is what we're talking about. So
That's a great point, Isaac. And I think there's some really cool examples of visual effects people have done at the State House to make a point. And I encourage people to always be thinking in that way too. Like, storytelling is not just verbalizing or writing something down, it's showing. Very good. Okay. I'm going to, I think we'll move on from this. Anyone else wants to share, by all means, you're most welcome. I don't want to stifle that opportunity. We don't often have big discussion times during these sessions, so I was excited today to have this little moment. Okay. So that being said, I'll go back to sharing my screen quickly, but I want to pass it back to Max to finish up.
Thanks, Allie. Yeah. So I loved getting to hear everyone's stories, and I think, you all, with just some of the examples you highlighted, demonstrated all of those different points we were talking about before of the power of stories, that they're memorable, that they're actionable, they motivate people to want to do things. So yeah, I love getting to hear those stories. And now that we've all sort of rallied around the power of stories and know why they're so important to advocacy, let's take a minute to talk about what kinds of stories can be super powerful when you're advocating. So you'll see here on the slide, we have some questions. After we move through our slide deck, we also have a worksheet that we'll be sharing with you all in the chat, and will be a part of follow-up as well, that has these questions for you all to reference as you're putting together your advocacy in the future as well. So let's break down a little bit, what kinds of questions might you want to ask yourself when you're thinking about what stories to choose or to highlight when you're advocating. So let's dive in. So before we pick our story, we first need to identify the goal of our advocacy. Why are we advocating in the first place? This can help us identify the kinds of stories that we think can make a difference, as well as helping us identify stories that we might not think are well aligned in this scenario. So, as an example, we could pretend that perhaps I'm meeting with one of our legislators or a member of Congress, and I've decided I want to talk to them about SNAP, or food stamps for folks who might not be aware of SNAP. And in this situation, if we apply the question, what's the goal of my advocacy? Well, then I might ask, well, what about SNAP do I want to talk about? What is it that I'm trying to create some change? And perhaps I want to encourage them in this example to make an amendment to SNAP that would allow people to buy hot foods. Currently, you're not allowed to purchase hot foods using your SNAP dollars. So now I have my goal for my advocacy: to convince our members of Congress to submit an amendment that would allow SNAP dollars to be spent on buying hot foods. Now, if we go to the next question, how will the story enhance this ask? Well, a story that details a time when someone wasn't able to buy hot food using their SNAP dollars and then had no other options can really demonstrate just how urgent and dire this change is, right? And it can also help people feel connected to this experience. As Jason's wonderful video, which was so powerful, showed, right? When we're thinking about and really able to experience why people are going through these things, right? When that young child was talking about, like, maybe it's because you don't have enough money for food, or maybe it's because they're homeless, right? Like, that's a really powerful thing to be hearing from a child's mouth, right? And so when we're thinking about how will the stories enhance our ask, we also want to think about, like, whose stories are we sharing? Do we have the right to share those stories, right? Are they our stories or someone else's? And it's always super important that if you don't have permission to share someone's stories, you don't. And I think that's just a super important thing as we're moving through this space, to always continue to reiterate to ourselves. There's such power in stories, but we only want to share stories we've been given permission to, or that we've experienced ourselves. And so continuing to move through this flow of questions. So we've identified that the story will enhance the ask by helping bring it to life and ensure that you really you understand the personal experience that's going on here for someone. And the next question is, who's my audience? Well, I've already talked about that. We've identified in this example that my audience would be members of Congress. And so knowing my audience helps me make certain assumptions. For example, I can assume they at least know what SNAP is or food stamps. And so I don't have to lay out any groundwork information of what the program actually is. At a basic level, they understand. Similarly, if this was a different scenario and I was talking to somebody else, you might have to explain a little bit of the program or the policy we're talking about, right? So in this scenario with Congress members and SNAP, probably not. But, as Isaac mentioned, municipal composting earlier, right? We might have folks at the city level who never even thought of compost. And so we might have to do a little bit more explanation there, a little bit more foundation setting before we can dive into using our story to help exemplify what we're talking about here. And when we're sharing our story, we want to keep it short. We want to keep it to 1 or 2 sentences that gets right to the core of what matters, why it matters, and what to do about it, what needs to change. So you can see there are some other questions here that might help frame your story. Is there a particular way to frame your story given your audience interests? So for our congressional members, right, we know they care about SNAP. So do we frame our story in a particular way that helps them feel more motivated to take action because of what they care about? Is there a part of the story that you want to focus on, right? If I'm thinking about, in my example of SNAP and hot foods, if I'm thinking about hot foods, I really want to emphasize that it's a hot food that they can't access, right? So in my example, I might include as part of the story, if it was in the winter that I knew a community member who was trying to access hot foods with SNAP benefits and couldn't. But I would want to tell that, right? Because that's important. When you're thinking about hot food in the wintertime as a way to keep warm, a way to keep your energy going. And so in my example, we really want to highlight that. And so we want to ensure that this story is discussed in the wider context, but also is very honed in on the issue that we're focused on. And then the final 2 questions here that can help influence your decision-making on which story you want to use is, what values or emotions are you hoping to bring up in your listener, right? Stories invoke feeling for people. So what are you hoping that they feel when they hear those stories? And how do you want those feelings to translate into action, right? We've already talked about it can motivate people, but how do you want that to motivate people? Do you want them to feel, ready to run out and start doing something? Do you want them to take some time to reflect on something first? Maybe you're saying, hey, this piece of legislation might have some negative impacts. I want you to really consider that, right? So thinking about those questions can be very important and very influential to how you want to tell your story and what you want to emphasize for people to take away from. So just as an example, if we think back to what I was talking about of Congress members, SNAP, hot foods, for my story, right, I'd want them to feel angered, frustrated. People are in need of this assistance, right? They're hungry, they're cold, they're looking for a hot meal, and they're unable to get it. And so when I'm thinking through all these stories and experiences, right, I would then maybe tell the story of a community member who's unhoused, who went to Cumberland Farms, right, hoping to get maybe like a hot dog, right, from their little rotating slide deck thing. And they got there, they walked all the way there, and then they found out I can't buy hot food with my SNAP benefits, right? So now they've walked all the way there, they've spent the time, the energy, they didn't get a hot meal, and they're still hungry. So that's a powerful story, but it's also concise, right? It's very short. You get the idea of the story, and then you're able to continue the conversation. And that's also important because we know legislators and folks we're advocating to don't have a ton of time. And so we need to be concise. We want it to be memorable while being concise. And so when we're choosing a story, we want to use this short story as a basis, for us to then be able to provide a strong advocacy message overall. And so we use, at the Food Policy Council, we use stories as the foundation for starting our advocacy message. And the way that we formulate our advocacy message is using this really cool formula called PAIRS. And so PAIRS, we can go to the next slide, Allie. Thank you. So PAIRS is a really cute acronym that we use, and it's pretty easy to remember since we're the Food Policy Council and we do love food here. PAIRS. So it's an acronym that describes the way for interacting with your legislators. It helps set up a formula for everyone to not only present a story, explain that story, answer the problems that you presented, make a request of an elected official, and then send. And I'm going to dive into each of these a little bit more deeply. But when we put this all together, it's a way of not just having one advocacy experience, but developing a relationship with your legislators. So that way, this is an ongoing advocacy experience between you and them for as long as they're an elected official and as long as you're engaged in advocacy. So engaging stories not only pull people into your message, but allow them to see it from a different perspective. And once your elected official has the story, then we want to give them the facts and the information they need to know to make the change. So that's how PAIRS comes in. So the P for PAIRS is present. So that's where I'm so glad, Isaac, you were eating a pear. That really builds this up excellently. So the P in PAIR is for present. So this is where you start off with that short story you've just chosen. And this story should be exemplifying the experience that you in the change that you're trying to create, right? So if we're thinking back to the hot food story, we want to create a change around that hot food restriction. So that's why we're going to focus on that part of the story. So you begin by presenting very shortly, 1-2 sentence story of why this issue matters, who's it's impacting, what it's impacting, and why. And then from there, then we go into E, which is for explain. And this is where you'll elaborate on your story by adding some relevant data or facts, right? If we think back to the research that we mentioned earlier, we know that the story is the thing they're going to remember. That's the 63% of the audience. They're going to remember that story. 5% will remember the data. So that's why you explain it afterwards, right? The story is the thing that's going to grab them, pull them into the conversation with you. Then you can add some of that relevant data to help back up the story, improve what you're experiencing. Then we move out of explaining into the answer, right? You've set up this meeting with your legislator or with your elected official because you have a proposal for a solution to address this issue that you've raised, right? So now you want to give them that answer. You're saying, hey, here's a story of a problem that we're experiencing. Here's how it's still coming up. Now, here's what you as an elected official can do about it. So here's your answer. Here's the solution to the problem we're talking about. And then we move into request. So you've told them what it is that needs to change. And now you're going to make a specific request of them as you're an elected official to do something about it. And those requests can vary. The request could start off as simple as something such as learn more, read more about why municipal composting is so important. Read more about why the landfill is going to be filling up in the next so many odd years, right? Or it could go all the way to, I want you to co-sponsor a piece of legislation on this issue to make a change. And the request should change with each legislator, with each advocacy experience you're having, right? Every time you're going to be building a relationship with them, every time you're going to be learning something new about their experiences, their work, what motivates them as a legislator. And so each time your request can be a little different, right? Maybe the first time it's learn more about this issue. And then maybe the next time it's, will you tell your colleagues that this issue matters? And then maybe it will be, can you sponsor a piece of legislation on this issue? Can you tell the chairman this piece of legislation is really important, right? So every time the request can change, but you want to be making a specific actionable request. You don't want to just say, do this thing, and maybe I'll come back and follow up with you about it. You want to make a request, and then the reason why we have multiple pairs, why the S, you need to send it. You need to do that follow-up. And that's where the relationship building really comes about. And so with that sending, you send the follow-up and you ensure that they know not just what matters and why it matters and what they can do about it, but that you're going to keep tabs on them to make sure that they're taking those actions, that they're taking those steps that you as their constituent have asked them to take. And so this entire method comes together to help create a excellent one-time advocacy experience, but also contribute to this ongoing relationship building with legislators. And so that's super important because when we're talking with legislators, our goal is to move them from apathy to action. So apathy, as you can see here, the way that we've sort of been defining it, is a lack of interest, enthusiasm, or concern. So we're looking to move them from being neutral or maybe even being an opponent to an issue, taking an action, right? Process of doing something. And there are a couple of ways that when we're sending that follow-up, when we're working on this relationship building, that we can do that. First, work on finding a shared agenda, right? Even if it's the smallest thing. This legislator cares about trees, and I also care about trees. That's great. That might seem so small, but that can be the catalyst for an incredible relationship to develop between you and a legislator. Second thing, if you can't find a shared agenda, connect your advocacy to their agenda. So if you know this legislator really cares about the economy, for example, right, and you care about trees, can you talk about the economic impact that having more trees in your neighborhood would have, right? More green space, more people doing things outside, people wanting to spend their money, et cetera, right? So finding a way to connect the thing you care about to the agenda that they already have. Similarly, you want to listen for ambivalence, right? If folks are saying, oh, yeah, that sounds like it might be important, that's an opportunity to really latch on and say, yes, it is important. Let me share some additional learning resources with you. Let me share this opportunity to come to an event in the community to hear about people's experiences on that issue. So listening for that ambivalence can help be the turning point in relationship building. And once you do get folks and legislators to agree to start maybe considering an action, or maybe they've taken a first step by doing some of the research you've asked, you always want to be restating their reasons for wanting change. If they've expressed to you that they agree with what you care about and that they think there's a need for change, whatever reasons they're giving you, you want to continue to restate. Every time you restate that, you're reminding them why they matter, why they care about this thing, and why it matters to them. And that's super important to helping build up the long-term commitment to these issues that we need to have. And then finally, as I've been saying this whole time, right, encourage your legislator to learn more or take action. Every time you're interacting with them, that's an opportunity to encourage them to do something. And you should. It's an easy way to help say the next time you run into them at an event, hey, did you have a chance to read that article I sent you? Hey, did you have a chance to watch that Channel 10 news segment yet? Right? That's an easy way to continue building up a relationship and encouraging them to learn more about the issues that matter to you. And so with that, we want to remember that advocacy is an ongoing process and that it's all about building up relationships, right? Legislators are people just like us, and we are all more likely to do something for our friends when they ask than for a stranger. That's just the way that the world works, right? And so when we remember that, we're able to leverage that relationship building to also create policy change that we want to see. And so as we consider how advocacy is ongoing, remember to ask open-ended questions. Legislators are generalists. They might not know everything. And so when you ask them an open-ended question, hey, how much do you know about food waste in Rhode Island, for example? You're giving them a lot of leeway to help share with you what they do and what they don't know. And that can help you target what information you're sharing, what you're advocating for, and all of those other pieces of information more strategically, because now you have a broader sense of understanding of what that legislator does. Similarly, recognize and reinforce success. If a legislator does the reading that you asked or watch the video that you asked, thank them. That's super important. That means that they're listening to you. And that's super important when we get to advocating and doing all the policy change that we want to see. So always thank them. Thank you for watching that video. Did you have any questions I could answer? Thank you for reading that news article. Were there any next steps that you weren't sure about? Was there anything that came up that you didn't understand? Those are so important for relationship building and for encouraging your legislators to recognize that you want to support them in doing a good job at their job, which is representing you. Finally, with relationships, value any progress as progress, right? There are going to be legislators that we know are going to be staunchly against some of the things that we care about. That's just the way the world works. And so anytime a legislator says, hey, I hear what you're saying, I think you're actually making a good point there. Again, we can thank them for that, right? Every time they're willing to do a little something, that's an opportunity to watch them progress forward and move more into the camp of food justice and food systems, and having a more just and resilient food system here in the state. And finally, as we mentioned in the last one, summarize what you hear folks saying, reiterating to them what you're hearing and why it matters and why they think it matters and why the community says it matters. Reiterating all of that and continuing to reiterate that is so important to, one, building up the sense of relationship and community, but also two, to reminding them there are folks still talking about this. Even if they're not talking to you every day, right? There are people in the community talking about these issues, and that's what matters. And so all of this is to say, remember, advocacy is ongoing. It doesn't have an end point or a start point. It's an ongoing process. And wherever you can tap in, practicing these skills and embedding these skills into the way that you're advocating are super crucial to creating the change we want to see. And so with that, I know we are starting to get close on time, and I want to take a moment to highlight for you all this really incredible resource that we have on the Food Policy Council's website. So Advocacy with Pairs, this is our storytelling worksheet. So this worksheet, it's two-sided. The front side is all about choosing your story, what we just went over earlier. Figuring out what the goal of your advocacy is, what kinds of stories you know of that can help influence all of this. What do you want folks to take away from? As well as giving you a couple of lines there to actually write that story out, right? You want to keep it concise, 1 to 2 sentences. So you have 3 lines there, you can practice it. And then on the opposite side of that, once you've picked that story, as we just went over with pairs, now we actually have the formula for you to put it all together. So you can transfer that story onto the back of the worksheet and then move through adding any notes about data points that you might want to highlight, what the solution is that you or your work group is proposing, what requests you'd be making of the legislators. And finally, you can also take notes on what things you might want to send them as follow-up. So this is a great resource, not only if you're putting together a piece of written testimony that you're going to submit to a legislator, or if you're having a meeting with them, you can bring this worksheet with you. It will have all the information that you might want to reference, right? It has your data, it has your stories, it has your answer. And in your sending section, it has a little bit of space where you might take notes saying, oh, legislator asked for this kind of follow-up. Let me make sure that I send them this news article that I referenced. Or, the legislator asked for another meeting. You can write down the date of that and send that in the follow-up email as a reminder. Hey, I'm looking forward for our next meeting on this date and this time. So this worksheet is key and super important to helping you really be able to combine everything we talked about today and have the most impactful storytelling for advocacy that you can have. And so with that, I'm going to turn it back to Allie to get us through the rest of our time today. And I will put the link in the chat for that worksheet.
Thank you, Max. That was awesome. I feel like this is one of the most useful tools that we have in our toolbox because it's so approachable. So I love that we get to share this with everyone. We'll email it out, of course, after this as well, but be sure to look for that link Max is going to share. The next session is something not so local. It's the Farm Bill. The Farm Bill is a federal piece of legislation. And so you may hear about it, and it's not just about farms. I think the most deceiving thing about the title of this legislation is that it is just about farms, but it is about every single piece of the food system. Anyone that eats should be paying attention to the Farm Bill. So I imagine that's everybody here and then some. So the next session will be on November 19th, again at noon. And just keep in touch with us if you have questions in advance or you want more context in advance. We did do a session on this last year. The Farm Bill is well overdue. They're supposed to update it every 5 years, and we are past that date. So it should be very interesting to see what happens in between now and November when we have this session. And then I also just want to pop Max and my contact information up here on the screen. If you have any questions about this session or other advocacy work that we are doing, these are the best ways to get in touch with us, which is basically email. But certainly just reach out anytime. And that is all, friends. We can wrap it up for the day unless there's questions. Beautiful. Thanks, y'all.
Thanks, Max and Allie. And
Thanks,
Jason.
everyone.
Yeah,
Thank you,
thank you,
everybody.
Jason. That was
Bye-bye.
awesome.
Thank you.